Yes, Vincent.
Just want to confirm, right? When you mention standard readability factor, you're talking about a multiplier or something like that, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay, so if everybody's generally on board with this recommendation, which I think reflects the party comments from the informal feedback gathered at the time of the level 4 recommendations, why don't we just skip to number 2? So what does the party recommend as a standard readability factor? And Katie.
I was just gonna speak to 1, and I think me speaking to 1 is gonna speak for 2 and 3. Turn does not have a strong opinion or really an opinion either way on this one. So we will listen and provide feedback as necessary, but
Does anyone else have ideas? I know Eric, you proposed some ideas in an email response yesterday. Do you want to
Yeah, you're talking to me. I assume Eric Wojcik. You can. Yeah. Thanks, Arnold. It seems to me that we need consistency or some approach that helps us compare and look at the various utilities, and then an approach that would just help us understand and get comfortable with some kind of a metric or a multiplier. Only one of the options is to use no multiplier, and it seems to me appropriate to use a multiplier. And so I recommended the middle ground or the middle option. A billion seems like too much, 1 seems like too little. So this is just, it seems like obvious points to me as we're talking about risk-based modeling and results, and particularly for the risk-based efficiency. So I don't know if other people looked at the survey questions. These were the survey questions. I was late in responding, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this particular recommendation or provide ideas for readability factor? Fred, go ahead, and then William.
Yeah, I think I'm just probably stating the obvious, but I think what we're interested in is having an RSE whose figures are primarily to the left of the decimal point. That's what we consider to be a more readable value, is when you have the significant figures of an RSE to the left of the decimal point in most cases. If there's no party suggestions over what the factor should be, that comes back to us, the staff, to try to look at all the different utility submissions and see what common factor would achieve that goal.
This is Gary from SCE. I just want to clarify that when we're talking about this readability factor, it's not to be used as a factor to compare scores amongst utilities. Is that correct? Because I believe level 4 has already acknowledged that using the current MAVF, RC scores are not comparable.
William, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. So this really has what this goes to is each of the different IOUs in our filing uses a readability factor in order to accomplish exactly what Fred was talking about, to shift things from very far to the right of the decimal, over more to the left of the decimal. And so we think that's fine. We think that's a good idea in terms of making it more readable to be in tables and in the reports and so on. The only challenge that we had was that the readability factor that was used was different for the different IOUs. And so if you're comparing, so in one set, if you're reading multiple reports from different IOUs, you have to remember, oh, these guys are using this readability factor. Oh, these guys are using that readability factor. And it would be helpful if everybody used the same readability factor, so that as a reviewer is shifting between reports, they don't have to mentally translate the scaling factor.
But the translation, you still have to do a translation, don't you? I mean, it's different MAVFs, right? So by definition, you already have to do an internal translation. I mean, wouldn't it be better just to look at the ranks or, relative deviations from each set of RSEs from each utility rather than force a common readability factor where we have different MAVFs?
I think that this is all happening after the MAVF and is dealing with the numbers that we're dealing with subsequent to that. I don't think they're related, in other words. I think that the MAVF and the readability factor decisions are independent.
So are we trying to compare scores amongst utilities?
Excuse me, this is Eric Wojcik with UCAN. I'll say, yes, I'm going to be trying to compare scores, and we've said they're not comparable or we don't have an ability to compare them, but I don't think that's correct. I mean, there's been a whole bunch of things that we've tried to make sure we can adjust in the MAVF, and I think we're getting closer to a similar approach across the utilities in the MAVF, as well as in their spend efficiency calculation. So this does help, and I certainly appreciate the comments made by William that it's hard to sort of put on one view of things and put on another view of things with a completely different scaling factor. And all we're trying to do is simplify that. So I don't see why there's going to be any complaint about it, or why there should be any issue about it. Let's just use something that's simple. The whole idea of this is not to make it more complex, not to make it higher transaction costs, more difficult to work through. It's to make it more clear and at least transparent and comparable if we can. Sure, electric utility is different than an electric gas utility. Gas utility is different than electric gas utility or electric utility. Those are the big drivers in the MAVF. But this is something that's simple. Can we just do this?
Yeah, and Gary, getting back to the root of your question here, which is the objectives for standardization. One of the things that I said a few meetings ago was our goal for standardization is consistency. The driving goal is not setting things up so that we can directly compare between the IOUs. However, by achieving consistency, we're moving in a direction where at least some aspects of the data will be comparable across the IOUs. And ultimately, we might get closer and closer to being able to compare at least some of the data across IOUs. But the initial goal, the goal for right now, is strictly to achieve consistency amongst the IOUs, so that when we're looking at and reviewing the reports and the results and so on, there's fewer variables that have to be analyzed. There's fewer things that have to be looked at. And as we move from report to report to report, there's less inconsistency where there doesn't need to be inconsistency.
Steve, did you have your hand raised?
Yes, previously. Just some thoughts. Currently, these risk scores are not comparable, and I somewhat echo Gary Chang's comments. So there's some thoughts. If risk scores are not comparable, well, let me phrase it another way. If risk scores are somehow made comparable down the road across IOUs, comparable across IOUs, the question of a common readability factor would essentially go away automatically through the comparability process. It would be automatic. It would automatically go away on its own. Now, if the scores are not currently comparable across IOUs, the problem with having a common readability factor is it may give the illusion that the scores are comparable when in fact they're not. So that's something to watch out for.
Thanks, Steve. That echoes my sentiment.
Yes, Fred.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. There's a we want to be sure that we acknowledge there are differences in the way IOUs come up with their risk scores. But let's look ahead a little bit. We're talking about now the readability of the risk spend efficiency. And when you've come up with your risk spend efficiency, you're looking at here's my risk and here's my estimated change. Based on the way I'm doing the score, I'm calculating a change. I'm going to change my risk by basically a percentage of my existing risk. So now the RSE is basically just a change in risk divided by the dollar cost of mitigation. So I think we're kind of a step removed now from the way those risk scores were determined. We're no longer caring about the magnitude of the risk score itself. We're just looking at a change value. So yeah, the change itself is in the magnitude of how the risk score was calculated, but I'm just thinking you're almost at the point where the RSE is kind of a standalone. And I'd be happy to hear arguments against that viewpoint.
So I don't think Fred, to answer your point, I don't think you can bifurcate the discussion of risk score versus RSE because the RSE is based on risk score. The numerator of the RSE are the risk score. So I don't think you can talk about RSE without talking about risk score. Whatever drawbacks or benefits of having a common readability factor that affects risk scores also affects the RSEs. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Steve. Does anyone want to respond to that? Okay. It seems like perhaps the first question really isn't a settled matter.
Arnold, this is Eric. I'm sorry. With you, Ken, I guess I will respond. This seems like we're making this out to be a tempest in a teapot here. It's a simple factor. Can we go for simplification? Does it hurt anything? I don't think it does. I think we should go forward. That's my recommendation. With a single scaling factor. Otherwise, I mean, come on. We got so many other things to discuss. Please, can we get on to other important topics?
Okay, thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. So maybe I could just get if all parties could just kind of, based on what they're hearing, state where how they feel about question number one or how they would respond to question one. Are they supportive of this recommendation or not supportive of it. I have Eric's take, obviously, so I'd like to hear from other parties.
I mean,
Our
we're
community
supportive
is,
of,
is supportive.
Is that Melinda? Yes, okay.
Yes, yeah, we're supportive. I think generally anything that makes it easier for the commission, the parties, and the public to understand is the goal here, and furthers transparency. So we're supportive.
Thank you. Vincent?
oh, I wanted to say we're supportive of a readability factor of 1,000 because that's what we use right now, but you know, for whatever it's worth.
Thanks, Vincent. Other parties?
This is Anna Yang, Advocates. We're in agreement with the UCAN and PCFC. We are supportive of this standard readability factor. But
Other than that, I'm working on the rest of the connection cases.
I'm sorry. Is somebody if you're not speaking, can you please mute yourself?
Cases on there too that might.
Sorry, did you hear what I said?
Yeah,
This
they
is
were
Anna
requested
Yang,
by
Cal
the
Advocates. I just want to voice that we
I'll
agree
try to
with
package it
what
together
UCAN
for
and
the
PCF said.
May.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
So yeah, we are supportive.
Assess that.
Other parties? IOUs? Oh, I already know. I already have Turn's position, which is no position right now. And I guess Sempra and SCE, did you guys have thoughts on it, or on the first question at least?
Yeah, hi, good morning. This is Greg Flores from SoCal Gas. You know, we don't necessarily have any issues with applying the readability factor. I think just to Steve Haynes' point, just a caution that just because you have similar characterizations by moving the decimal doesn't necessarily result in comparability, because as you know, to the point, there may be differing underlying attributes and process. So just a caution.
And I guess we have SCE's take on this, I think.
This is Dan from SE. I think we kind of agree with Sempra's previous comment there that we're not necessarily against their readability factor. We just want to make sure that parties realize it may not have the intended consequences.
Okay. Okay, thank you for the input. And I wonder then if we've heard from Eric, we've heard from Vincent about question number 2, what does the party recommend? So if we were to assume to go forward with this recommendation, Eric, I think you mentioned 10,000, a factor of 10,000, and Vincent said a factor of 1,000.
No, I thought it was, you offered 3 recommendations. It was the middle recommendation. I think that's 1,000.
Oh, 1,000.
Right, that the PG&E recommendation. That was so.
Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts on, does anyone want to, or feel strongly about one of these multipliers?
It's Gary from SCE. I don't think we can talk about this without understanding what's the denominator. Is it in thousands or millions first?
That's a good point, because I recall in PG&E's case, they do the RSE in per millions of dollars. So that would need to be looked at.
Just to let you know, SE does our GRC and ramp in thousands in terms of the denominator.
Hi, Joseph Mitchell from Mussey Grade. No strong opinion on what it should be, just the overarching consideration that you want to minimize zeros and insignificant digits on both sides of the decimal point. So nothing too large, nothing too small. So that should be where you should be aiming to set your readability factor.
Thank you, Joe. Does anyone else want to offer an opinion or comment? I don't see any hands raised. All right. Are there any other related considerations that we should think about before proceeding with this? All right. Okay. So thank you everybody for your feedback on this recommendation. I think seems like we might have exhausted this conversation a bit. Why don't we take a 10-minute break now? It's just about 10:30. We'll start up again at 10:40. And then we'll go to the next topic on environmental social justice. If you haven't had a chance to look at the question and prompt for this particular topic, maybe you can do that in these 10 minutes and then we'll have the discussion after that. So 10:40, please do that. Thank you. All right, it's 10:40. We'll get started with the second topic for today. And that's regarding environmental and social justice impacts. Before we get started, I'll just take a quick roll call, make sure everybody's here. Cal Advocates, here.
Yes, Anna Yang is here.
Turn. Oh, I see. you.
Here.
NGRA, Joe Mitchell.
Here.
UCAN, Eric. Okay, we'll go back. PCF, Melinda.
Here, yes, I'm here. Thanks.
Sempra. SCE.
Edison is here.
And PG&E.
Elijah Devon is here. I'll follow up with where Vince is at.
Thanks, Elijah. And Eric, I see you. Okay, thank you guys. Okay, we'll get started on the second topic for today's technical working group. And I'll just read the scoping memo issued for which it's related. Should the commission consider impacts on environmental and social justice communities, including the extent to which action in this proceeding impacts achievement of any of the 9 goals of the commission's environmental and social justice action plan? At this point, I will turn it over to Ben, who will facilitate the rest of this conversation.
Thank you, Arnold. So this one was actually kind of a challenging question for us, and so I appreciate any suggestions y'all have, given that the nature of risks and consequences that are evaluated in the ramp aren't the typical kind you think of when you think of like social justice, environmental justice issues. We're not talking about like chronic exposure to air pollution and from folks living next to refineries or freeways or agricultural dust and those kind of things. So when they were developing the new action plan, they asked us what we thought would be a possible way of addressing this within the ramp and within the SMAP, and I didn't actually realize they were going to take our conversation and put it into the report, but they did. So this is what ended up in the environmental social justice action plan. So it's our tentative proposal, pending y'all's feedback or additional substitute ideas on how to incorporate environmental social justice into the risk-based decision-making framework. So the general idea is, I'll just read it off here real quick. Require IUs to overlay plant infrastructure mitigations on the CalEnviroScreen map to identify what portions of the mitigations would occur within disadvantaged communities. When geographic locations of proposed mitigations are known, include the DAC portion, proportion percentage of the mitigation in the ramp narrative, and what risk reduction is estimated for that DAC portion. So essentially, it'd be like, well, what are the risks that are in environmental social justice communities as identified per the CalEnviroScreen system, and then what proportion of mitigation expenditures are taking place in there. And I think the idea is that it would be a proxy for are we investing risk reductions at the same proportion in EJ communities as investing proportionally to where the risks are in EJ communities, because historically EJ communities have been neglected when government agencies are evaluating projects. So that's about it. I don't know. And then we also included in the slide presentation a list of the goals that are laid out in the EJ plan, but I don't think we want to go through all of those. You can view those or. But it's open up the thoughts, feedback, alternatives from the group. Dr. Wojcik.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I recall, and I think in the DER discussion, Distributed Energy Resources, that the Cal EnviroScreen map process has already been used for DAC, disadvantaged communities. And it's moreover also used in clean air modeling that goes into the IRP, I believe. I think those are the two, at least two other places where this is already done. Is that, do other people have similar recollections, or isn't that right?
Yeah, Dr. Borchek, I think you're right. This is Brian from Edison. I think it's also included in the climate adaptation proceeding as well. So yes, it's already in a number of proceedings.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Landry.
Yeah, it's used pervasively throughout state government at this point.
Right.
I know in my last job at Resources Agency and conservation, we used it at that point too. It's been updated, I believe, 3 times. I think we're in phase 3 of the model.
Yeah. So then this would just be a continuation of that to make sure we have mitigations. Yeah. Thanks.
Katie has her hand.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Katie has her hand up, and so does Dr. Savage.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important question. And I actually, I have some initial thoughts, but I also wanted to request more time. And I saw in the email you were requesting feedback by Monday, but Monday is a turn holiday for Juneteenth. And that, I guess I would like more time than that. We have people on our staff that are very well versed in race and equity impacts, and I'd like to talk to them, but it's going to take some getting them up to speed on the SMAP and RAMP in order to probably have a helpful conversation. So I would request a couple of weeks if possible. I think that we can have better feedback, because I think that this is really important to get right. My initial thoughts as I was looking at the ESJ report this morning and your questions is I like the idea of acknowledging and targeting where work is happening and the overlay with the DACs. I think there's perhaps ways of, and I need to think through all of these ideas more, but I think also identifying for DACs and other communities what risk there are, because I think it's not just about, I think we're going to want to balance what the risks are, what the potential mitigations are, how those are different across different communities to both balance an optimal risk mitigation program that is targeting the highest, most important risk, but also making sure that it's equally applied. And then I think the last thing I wanted to bring up, and this is where I wish I was more personally plugged into the ESJ, but especially right now, Californians are facing an affordability crisis, and because of the regressive nature of rates, that's tending to hit lower income communities a lot harder than it is others. So we really need to be thinking about how to maximize the use of every dollar and how to have affordability constraints. And I think identifying how that plays into the identification of a risk mitigation portfolio is going to be a really important piece of ensuring that we have plans that are, like I said, both maximizing risk reduction, limiting the amount of rate increases, and also addressing different communities proportionally. So that is my initial take. But like I said, I really appreciate more time, because I think that this is an important subject that requires a lot of thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
I'll just respond real quick. I'll defer to Arnold on the more time, because he's thinking about the time frame. But I also want to just say that that it is this isn't going to be the end of it. This will be like a first step. So we want to have another track after this track. So we don't have to solve everything. Like just as the same as with all the other issues, this would just be this is like a first step. But there's a lot of more work to do. Like and this could be included. I mean, one of the things we thought about was like, well, like the ramp basically just deals with like burning things down and blowing things up. Like that's like basically all it deals with. I think that's oversimplification, but that's primarily what it deals with, and it doesn't deal with. I mean, there's a lot of other variables we could look at and attributes and risks we could incorporate, but at this point, with the relatively focus on those like catastrophic kind of events, we it doesn't sync really well with a lot of the chronic issues we've seen with ESJ communities and other fora. So we can just do it. I think it's okay if we just have this be an initial step. We don't have to figure it all out and solve all the problems with this. But Commissioner Rechtshaven definitely wants to do something in this before he leaves on this topic.
I'll just add that we are under some severe time constraints at this point. And so that's going to limit how much we can get done on this. But as Ben said, we'd like to just, be in a better place than we were yesterday, and then keep progressing and building upon that. Okay, so Sam, and then Brian, and then Joe Mitchell.
Yeah, thanks. So what I want to suggest is, if we recognize a risk, like blowing people up or burning things down, that really needs to go into the risk spend efficiency calculation, right? And that's like, if you are driving and you drift over the center line to the wrong oncoming lane, you really need to get back in the right lane. But I want to suggest that there may be another category of things that would be more akin to a warning light on the dashboard that says, check your tire pressure, right? Because these environmental things, I mean, you can't ignore them, and they could be disproportionately, affecting some neighborhoods rather than others. But if we had a category of things called warning lights, that you at least need to be aware of it in some formal manner. Like, you got to check the tires in your car, you got to check the tire pressure in your car, but it's not baked into how you drive the car currently, right? And we don't have to go through there'd be a lot of work, I think, to add to the RSE calculation certain kinds of environmental things that should be there eventually, right? So I'm just saying, a category of things that feed the RSE, and a separate category called warning lights, if you will, that just, you've got to track them because they could be serious down the road, and we may want to put them into the RSE eventually.
Thanks, Sam. Brian, and then Joe Mitchell.
Hey guys, so thank you very much. So this is Brian Landry from Edison. So I want to thank everyone for taking up this topic. I know it's something that Edison is fully supportive of, at least supporting the commission's ESG goals. This may be an important first step. Obviously, we just got this a few hours ago, and we want to have some more time to understand the ramifications of it. From what I know about the disadvantaged community locations in Edison's territory, there is not a great overlap with some of the risks that we've outlined in our ramp. Certainly there are some that there's probably an overlap spatially in some of these communities. But for instance, the larger ones like HFRA, we just don't have that many disadvantaged communities within HFRA, for instance. Other risks that we have, such as hydro, there's probably not that much of an overlap either. So I'd be cautious to stakeholders to expect a lot of movement in terms of some of these risks if we develop an ESJ overlay or ESJ sort of carve out. So just want to caution everyone about that. Thank you.
That's a really good point, Brian. And I think that's true in a lot of the service territories, right? So yeah, there would be, and that kind of gets to the affordability crisis, like, because folks throughout the state are paying for wildfire mitigations, like, folks in Fresno and Stockton and Benicia and stuff are all paying for wildfire mitigations, but they don't have that risk in their territory. So yeah, that's a really good point. Did you say Joseph Mitchell was next, Arnold?
Yes, Joe Mitchell.
Yeah, that's I wanted to follow up on the affordability point. We did sort of a rough calculation of impacts using mortality or life expectancy curves versus income. This was in the WMPs and also in our testimony on the PG&E GRC. And a substantial rate increase, such as we've been seeing, it turns out if you apply it to a large enough population, the effect, or if there's a cause and effect there, there's a correlation that might suggest that you are actually causing harm across the population sufficient to be equal to or larger than the effects of, for instance, wildfire. So it's an awfully big topic to take into account and to do it properly. This is just, as we've stated, an example of how such a calculation might be done. I'm sure there are plenty of things wrong with it, but the fact that you could do a back of the envelope calculation like this and come out with a surprising result that if you look at the most vulnerable communities, they may be having health and safety impacts that are the same or greater than people in wildfire prone communities are having. So just from the rate increases.
That's a really interesting observation. You said that was that provided in comments on your wildfire mitigation plans?
Yes, you'll find it in our wildfire mitigation plan comments, and pretty much the same thing has gone into the PG&E GRC testimony that we put out this week.
Great, thank you.
It looks like Vincent might have his hand up. I'm not sure, and then Jordan Addison as well.
Yeah, my question was more of a kind of if you could go back to the previous slide. My question was more kind of process question, or because it says the plan would require IOUs to overlay plant infrastructure mitigations on the Cal screen map. So where will this be done? In which filing? Do we have to do additional filing? Is it getting done right now? Is the proposal to do it in our RANT? I'm just like to understand a little bit how this suggestion will be implemented.
So I suppose it could be like very little thought has actually gone into this. So you should just caveat with that. This started from a conversation with Commissioner Rexhoffen's office, and then appeared in this report, and then I was reminded of it recently. It could be in the ramp. It could be if there's sufficient knowledge of where specifically where you anticipate placing the investments. It could say like this is the proportion of risk reduction investments that occurred in Cal screen identified disadvantaged communities, or it could be I guess an additional piece on the RSAR where here's where we spent our money. It was this proportion of it was in a DAC as identified by environmental social justice community, or it could be both. I guess like here's the proposed expenditures, and here's where we actually ended up doing it. So we're hoping to kind of tease out some additional comments and ideas and in this conversation.
Thank you.
Looks like Katie has her hand raised and Jordan Addison.
Yeah, so a question, I guess, to better understand what we're working towards now. I mean, is the goal just to have, is the goal to be creating new requirements or are identifying ways to be introducing these issues into the ramp? Is it just to kind of have done something? I guess I ask because one place where my mind goes thinking about this is, especially after Brian's comment, identifying how the risk in the ramp reports, identifying or comparing the risk of the whole utility territory versus the risk in the portion of the DAC that is, or the portion of their territory that is DAC. So kind of highlighting that potential misalignment of risk overall versus in these communities could be at least an interesting point of reference and interest to be included in the ramp and considered as you go through the GRC.
Yeah, I think it's intended to be a first step to introduce this kind of information into the ramp. So yeah, consideration of environmental and social justice issues in the ramp, and then also kind of provide, like, one of the things I was thinking about was providing some kind of insight into you know, where the risk reduction priorities are. So like if there's like it's true, well, it's true that there's like if you know, look at the high fire risk areas compared to ESJ, like the worst ESJ places are, you know, next to the ports and along freeways, next to refineries, like and then agriculture has a huge impact with water, access to clean water, and the particulate matter. So yeah, they're not a lot of the, like, you wouldn't see utilities as a driving factor that led to them being identified as a disadvantaged community in many instances, I guess in power plants in some cases. But it's like most of it is like bad water, like nitrate contaminated water, particulate matter from agriculture and from diesel. So those are the biggest factors in the EnviroScreen. So yeah, it's like this would just be an overlaying. Where are we spending? Are we spending our money proportionally in those communities, or disproportionately away from those communities that are in a bad spot currently?
So, follow-up question. I mean, is utility spending in that way going to have an impact in those communities if it's not a utility caused issue? Because then I think you go back to what Joseph was talking about, which is the primary impact from utility spending is actually going to be on the affordability rather than these other issues that I'm not saying we don't need to address them. We absolutely do. It's just, is additional utility spending going to be the thing that addresses, you know, polluted water?
No, it would just make sure we're not leaving, like, do we want to, like, there, like, I think one of the things is shedding light on affordability. Like in the affordability proceeding, they're talking about, like, one of the questions in the last scoping memo was about, like, well, should we have disparate rates for different regions based on the where the costs are being spent? And I think this would help inform that kind of question. So there's that side of it, and then the other side of it is like, if there are risks in these communities, is there equitable expenditures being you know, spent towards them? So to the extent that there are risks, are the expenditures equitable? So there's like the two separate issues, like typically investment has not gone to these communities, even in cases where they needed it, and issues that were germane to them. So now we're sitting here on the ramp and we're talking about issues that, like, risk drivers that really aren't necessarily present in a lot of these communities, but to the extent they are, is there a proportional amount of investment occurring in them? And then the other, so that's one. Then the other side is, like, well, there's these disadvantaged communities all over the state that are bearing the burden of these additional costs, but all the expenditures are occurring outside of their neighborhoods. Does that make sense? Am I being comprehensible?
Okay, let's go to Jordan. I don't know if Jordan's still.
Appreciate it. So from some perspective, again, I think echoing what some of the utilities said, we want more time to look at this. I think also would be helpful. Apologies, this is, kind of extensively documented. I haven't seen really definitional concerns on how are we defining a disadvantaged community, from the action plan goals, how are we defining equity, because there's a difference between equitable spending and equal spending, right? Because there's an element of fairness there that I'm not sure has been fully fleshed out. And to Brian's point earlier, there's going to be a lot of variation between how the utilities look at our populations in this regard. So I think it'd be helpful to have some additional guardrails, in the context of the purpose of these TWGs, discussing standardization, to understand, what the guardrails are, how some of these things are defined, and how they connect to ramp, or potentially as a standalone issues we need to look at.
So some of those the definitions I can paste one of the so disadvantaged. I was thinking we'd rely on the definitions that are used in that in the action plan. So here's I just pasted in the disadvantaged community definition, and then certainly I believe the distinction between equity and equality is discussed in the plan too. But we can run that down. But yeah, certainly we're cognizant of the need to define things. Joseph.
Yeah, just one technical point I wanted to raise here is that when we're talking about rate impact issues, is that actually on the GRC side or is that on the ramp side? Because because it's actually, it doesn't really get instantiated until the money, the rates are actually determined. So for instance, we just put in comments on SCE's ramp. We did not put this topic in because it's, I think it seemed to me that it was more rate versus other safety impacts oriented, although it has both aspects. So that's something that you might want to be thinking about. I don't know quite how to frame the question myself.
Yeah, that's a it's almost analogous to like PSPS is a mitigation and a impact. It's like affordability. Like if that's so, the expenditures are reduce risk, but then if it's offset by health impacts as you're describing, that would be ideally something that would eventually get dealt with in the ramp. But I think it's a new layer of complexity that would have to take a long time to incorporate. That perhaps we should start looking at. Jordan's still got his hand up. Do you want to talk? Do you have more comments?
Oh, no, apologies. I forgot to lower it. Thank you, though.
Oh, it's okay. Brian you raised your hand again.
Hey guys, so I just put SCE's current version of the DAC map for reference in the chat. So if everyone wants to just use that, obviously this is built on Cal Enviroscreen 3, but we have now moved to Cal Enviroscreen 4. But I just wanted to, if you're trying to picture this in your head, you can just look at the map that we pasted in the chat, at least for Edison's territory.
Thank you. Yeah, I realize we just kind of sprung this on you, but are there other comments or initial feedback or thoughts? Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. You can just to quickly go back. The point was made that we should ideally go back and review this. Well, go back review it later in a more complete way. Is there any ideas or thoughts about how we can do that? And thanks to Turn for that suggestion. From the commission, maybe?
Fred's raising his hand. Do you want to respond to that, Fred?
Yeah, one thing that occurs to me, we had a pretty recent instruction from the administrative law judge that we had to get a proposed a staff proposal pretty quickly, and that's why we've got a kind of a time crunch on these things right now. My thought is that if we as staff go ahead and put something on this topic into a staff proposal, then there is the standard amount of time for proposal to receive comments, for the judge to put our proposal into a proposed decision, which receives comments. And I would, I would hope that that could afford the kind of time people would like to have to fully consider something that, would be on the table. And that could be an avenue for receiving the comments that people want to make over a longer period of time, I hope.
Yeah, that's a good point, Fred. Arnold, it might be useful to just kind of describe to folks what we're looking at in terms of a process. I don't know if that's been articulated to the group.
Well, I was going to do that at the close. Do people want to hear about that?
Yeah, sure. That works. William.
So looking at the SCE map, if we look at that, most of the areas that fit within the Cal and viral screen areas are large tracts of land that are out in rural areas. And that kind of matches with what I would guess in San Diego County, in that there's very large areas in the East County that have a lot of poor people living there, well below the median income, just by the nature of things. So if we're doing it based on investment and geography of what fits into the tracks, I think this is going to make the investments look very good, because those poor rural areas, at least in San Diego, for example, the cost to underground, the cost to covered connectors, the cost to do vegetation management is going to be disproportionately spent in those areas. And so that's going to look good. If we're doing it, on the other hand, in terms of number of people, I think that those places tend to have very low population density. And so if what we're trying to say is how many disadvantaged individuals are impacted, then I think that the approach that you're outlining will not be an accurate reflection of the number of disadvantaged individuals because most of those are, as Ben was talking about, concentrated in more of the urban areas, the more poor urban areas. So just an observation.
Good point. Thank you, William. Fred, did you have your hand? Did you want to add anything, or just? Any other comments, thoughts? Okay, well, I think thanks everybody for your initial reactions to that. We appreciate it, and I think, like Fred said, I mean, there'll be I think we're going to try and come up with something, and then folks can propose alternatives and other or critiques, provide insights into additional complexity that didn't occur to us, and all that in responding to the proposal. So if there's nothing else, you can also just email us, or if you have additional thoughts or things you'd like us to look at.
All right, thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. At this point, I was basically going to update the group on the timeline. I don't have it in writing within the slide deck because there's a little bit of flux in between, sort of the process to which by which we get to those deadlines. Next week, we originally intended to have another technical working group on another level 4 recommendation. We decided not to go that route because time just wasn't available. So instead, next week, we're hoping to have a set of recommendations ready to present to the group in a workshop format. Well, I guess I should ask is, I know SCE, they have a workshop on June 30th, is that correct? Regarding the RAM?
That is correct. So we'll likely have to move that workshop to have SE's participation on June.
Okay, so what about everybody's availability for Wednesday, June 29th? Does that work, or does anyone have any major conflicts? Okay. Otherwise, I would have offered June 30th, but that's the Friday before the July 4th holiday, so I assume people prefer not to have it then. Okay, so June 29th is when we'll shoot for the next session as a workshop, and we're hoping to present our recommendations based on the record that we've developed here over the last 2 months. Put those recommendations out to the group. I don't know if we'll have those things in writing before the workshop. We're hoping to actually take enough oral feedback during the meeting itself, but there may be complications with that, so we're still in discussions, and we'll let everybody know what the plan is concretely as soon as possible. But for now, just mark the calendars for June 29th as the next workshop date. And then July is essentially composed of internal processes, a lot of review from our team, from the CPUC. And then August 4th, we expect to have a staff proposal issued via rule. And as Fred said, that's an opportunity to provide formal comments back to the CPUC by the end of August. So that comment period will take us to the end of August. And then take your feedback, make additional recommendations or revisions as needed. And then the ALJ is going to work on the proposed decision over the course of September and October, and proposed decision is expected to be issued in October. And then, of course, the final decision in the commission vote meeting in December. So that's kind of where we're at right now. Does anyone have any questions or concerns? Okay, and Mike Pence, oh, go ahead, Fred.
I thought I'd step back on the ESJ question a little bit. I didn't have any comment or concern about what you said about the schedule, but when we're finished discussing that, I just wanted to mention something about the use of the CalEnviro screen, et cetera. But Vincent also raised his hand, so why don't we hear from him first?
It's another kind of process question. So is it possible to move that Monday deadline for comments?
Yeah, I mean, it's unlikely we're gonna keep it at Monday. You mean regarding the ESJ?
Yeah.
Yes. I think we'll have to discuss internally and get a new date out as soon as possible, but I want to speak with the group first before we make that decision. But yeah, I don't expect Monday to be the due date for any comments.
Thank you.
Okay.
So yeah, Arnold, just circling back a little bit. One way I see this kind of thing about using the Enviro screen map to identify what risks exist in disadvantaged communities versus not. It would kind of be introducing a new tranche boundary, if you will. So you already have tranches based on either a different frequency or different consequences in a particular portion of the infrastructure. One scenario could be that I've got a gas pipeline that runs through a DAC and also not in a DAC along its length. And without the DAC consideration, you might have one uniform tranche risk for a portion of your infrastructure. But now if you introduce a DAC boundary, you might have exactly the same risk score in the DAC and not in the DAC, but presenting the information that a portion of a given risk is within a DAC could give the commission the opportunity to decide, well, do we want to favor mitigation spending in this DAC versus not? That's just the kind of scenario I imagine we might be able to support. Then, whether the commission decides to act on that would be up to, debate in the GRC, for example, but it would afford the opportunity to have that consideration if people wanted to take advantage of it. That's kind of what I see. And I'm open to thoughts about that being worthwhile.
Eric has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. With you, Ken. That seems like a very interesting and potentially very good thing to do, particularly to be specific about the DAC and to use the Cal Environment Screen to map that. Like I was saying earlier, it seems consistent with a lot of other things that we're trying to do in California and use the Cal Environment Screen, but spending in the DAC for mitigation does seem like something that the commission is focused on, but I'm not sure we've been very successful in implementing those kinds of policies. It looks a little messy, but on the other hand, within the DAC, it just seems logical to me. I guess that's all I'm really saying, and I think UCAN will want to support that. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Any other comments, or should I turn it back over to Arnold?
Well, okay. It looks like there are no more comments on ESJ. Thanks, Fred, for the contribution. I think we can adjourn here, but as I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to our team, or has any comments, or just want to meet and discuss further. Feel free to contact us. Appreciate your participation today, and I want to thank Brevin Fong for supporting us from IT. Thank you, everybody. I think we can adjourn at this point.
Thanks very much, Arnold.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Great job, Arnold.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Perfect.